圧倒する力が叩く、ねじ伏せる。
Monster Hunter Rise was a huge success in Japan along with the West, making millions of sales when initially released. Although financially it was a success, there were mixed feelings with many players who were familiar with the franchise. Some felt the game was too easy, while others felt it lacked content since it was one of the shortest Monster Hunter games to complete. With the arrival of Sunbreak, many hoped this was a DLC expansion that could potentially change how Monster Hunter Rise can be. In this video, I'll go over and talk about the quality Sunbreak has to offer and discuss if it is really something to look forward to after the base game of Rise. This critique video only covers the base DLC expansion that Sunbreak has without the title updates. Also, who knows? Maybe the updates in the future will actually change the game more. Let's first start off talking about the story. And just like any other Monster Hunter game, or at least with Monster Hunter World, the story is very surface level, or simple to say the least. I still enjoyed it for what it was, and the story seemed much more focused compared to the base game of Rise. There was build up and tension whenever there were significant points of the story. What I did notice were the quality of cutscenes involving not just the story but also the monster intros. Both story cutscenes and monster intros seemingly were longer and showcased much more detail into them. For cutscenes with story, this was such an improvement compared to Rise, since Rise's story along with its cutscenes just felt random at times. Not only did cutscenes felt short and didn't show much, but the story literally in the base game was all over the place. You could easily skip the main story cutscenes and important build-up of the story by simply playing the Gathering Hub quest. I noticed as a fact, since when I bought my PC version of Rise, I just went straight to the Gathering Hub to progress quicker to the endgame of Rise. Once I beat the Gathering Hub quests, basically beating the true ending for the game, I decided to finish all my village quests, and I still experienced certain cutscenes that were to be shown in the beginning of the game, but that was just casually shown as I progressed through the village quest even after I completed its true ending. The pacing for the story felt all over the place. I even talked about this before when I initially completed Rise last year on the Nintendo Switch. Sunbreak though fixes the pacing of the story and feels much more organized. If you want to progress with the whole story and level up your master rank, you are forced to complete the urgent quest. The story isn't split up into two areas of the game where you do village quests and gathering hub quests. It is all in the urgent quest line when progressing through the game, which should have been like that for the base game, especially if the team is providing a story. Regardless, Monster Hunter is not known for its narrative and does much more world building. Also, I'm aware that the OG games just make you hop into the game, just how Rise's formula does it. But again, it is not necessarily an excuse when Rise is actually trying to tell a story to the players. A nice addition to some of the single player content is the follower quest. Follower quests are sort of the side content, or maybe you could actually consider it the village quest for Sunbreak, where you're able to accompany certain characters within the game. I will talk about the pros and cons of these follower quests, but the coolest thing about it is you're able to know these characters more through these hunts. As you are hunting with them, they have all these unique dialogue and personalities to them. This is something I didn't expect Monster Hunter to do at all, but surprisingly, they are quite detailed. Also, the way they hunt is different for certain characters. For people who have done the follower quests, Luchika is definitely one of the most wholesome and yet funniest hunters to be with. She's very shy when you meet her in Elgato, but when doing her follower quest line, she starts to open up and shows how wild she gets in these hunts. Again, it's quite impressive how simple but yet impressive the team did with these quest lines. I hope to see more with the future updates for Sunbreak and future Monster Hunter titles, since it is very beneficial to give much more detail to its story or characters. With the gameplay presented in Sunbreak, I didn't expect the game to be really refreshed with how much changes and approaches are made for the game. Things such as each monster is fully changed with how their movesets and how much more aggressive they are. The variety of builds and variations you can make with each weapon is very addicting and fun. I was also overwhelmed with the switch skills. Initially, I didn't use it as much in the beginning of my playthrough since I wasn't familiar with it, but later on throughout the game, I decided I felt the need to use it since some monsters started to overwhelm me through these hunts. I really do think the switch skills is such a nice addition to the gameplay. Also, it is completely optional to use. You could still remain using one of the set of skills, but it is much more optimal to utilize both switch skills. I think also developers did a great job on making everything within these hunts important. To use wire bugs, certain battle items, or tools you could use that are scattered in each map. There's much more emphasis in its gameplay for nearly everything around a hunter, and is important for the player to use or react to. Which leads to the topic of the difficulty. How is the difficulty in Sunbreak? As someone who has experienced many hunts in a full party to being solo in a hunt, I think things are much easier when you are with a group. But with how things are when being alone, it actually gets much more overwhelming, especially when you are progressing to the end of the main story and post-game. I really do feel that when using wire bugs for mobility or silkbind attacks, they are much more important to use compared to the base game, because these hunts can get a bit crazy and their default cooldown time is crucial when not having any wire bugs to use against a very aggressive monster. So there is much more strategy to use the wire bugs itself, resulting in players wanting to have certain skills that involve wire bug usage to their builds. I also feel very safe and thankful when wyvern riding, since it gives hunters a little bit of a break time from the hunt, since the opposing monsters really do pack a punch. And when wyvern riding, it really does help a lot to put in big damage towards monsters, since they also have a lot of HP. A typical hunt takes about 10 to 20 minutes depending how well you hunt with the decent optimal gear. I am aware that there are hunters that do these hunts within a few minutes, but compared to the base game, it is quite different, since hunts in base game can take about only 10 minutes or less. Now there is just much more to go through in these hunts, and can potentially go over about 20 minutes when having a difficult time with the monster. Although these hunters are able to do crazy things in terms of mobility and combat, the monsters actually manage to keep up. Capcom sort of found that right balance where we don't necessarily feel overpowered. Monsters are just much faster, aggressive, and do way more follow-up attacks. I found myself being afraid by these certain attacks, especially on my first encounter with these monsters. The difficulty in Sunbreak is there, but when being with a group of other hunters, the hunts tend to be progressively easy. The big question is now, should they have made the multiplayer hunts much more balanced instead of making these monsters seem much of a pushover? I personally believe that just a few tweaks should be made when in multiplayer. An example I could give is make the monster much more aggressive and give it more HP. I really do feel that how the devs approached Sunbreak's gameplay balancing was nearly perfect because of the hunts when I solo. I definitely really felt the difficulty of the hunts were really pushing it, and I really felt my decisions when approaching these hunts were important. There's much more strategy to open up the hunts than simply being brain dead just to slay the monster. But back to whether multiplayer should be tweaked to be more difficult, I think it is important to come to mind that multiplayer was designed to help other hunters, especially if they are struggling. It's also why there's a whole system called helper rewards, where you get more rewards from the hunt when helping random people around the world who are requesting others to join their hunts for help. It's important to think as well that if multiplayer hunts are more difficult, it would be a pain to constantly farm the same monster over and over again, which can lead to burnout, especially if it is hard to farm or just much more time consuming. It's sort of a difficult topic to discuss, since there's people out there like myself who want much more difficult hunts in multiplayer, but there's another spectrum. If it did happen, there would be other problems, such as players leading to burnout of the game due to the hunts taking forever or being tedious to complete. And what I did notice is that from what I've experienced is when playing with just two people in the hunt still has the difficulty of what you could sort of experience solo. So being in duos does have that sweet spot of difficulty that people want for multiplayer, and I actually recommend having a buddy to join you for these first time hunts, since you can't necessarily matchmake with another hunter. Joining hunts usually open up to everyone if the hunt is open and available for 3 other hunters, so I guess that could be a temporary solution if you still want to experience a hunt with someone that has difficulty It's just unfortunate you have to limit yourself with just the two of you. With the topic of co-op at hand, let's finally talk about the follower quest. Follower quest is purely single player content of the game where you're able to accompany characters within Rise and Sunbreak's story. I mentioned earlier that follower quests are somewhat the side quests of the game where you're able to get to know more about the characters. Within these quests, there is another type of quest very similar to it called support surveys, which allow you to bring any character that you have done a follower quest with, and pretty much these quests have every monster, elder dragon on the list on what you can hunt together and get a lot of parts for. What also makes the support survey quest unique is that you're able to see other characters' skills on what they have, and you're able to make them wield different weapons on what's available for these particular characters. I haven't really made any of the characters use a different weapon. I made them use the weapon that they're comfortable with, which is their default weapon they use when they accompany you. But the fact that this is an option for the quest would really help out in these various scenarios you could be put in that could potentially benefit you depending what type of hunt it is. This also gives much more option on whether you want to hunt with randoms online or hunt with basically yourself with the AI companions that don't cart at all. They go down, but they don't cart, compared to the actual hunters when joining a random quest. So you pick and choose what you want. It's a great alternative way to grind out your builds without the worry of losing less rewards because of randoms carting. The thing about AI companions is that from my experience, it's pretty much a 50-50 with how they behave. There will be times where they just aren't as useful and just be there, while sometimes they are very useful and help the process of these hunts go much quickly. Also within these follower or survey quests is that you're able to have 2 members on your team while still have your Palico and Palamute compared to multiplayer where you're only able to bring one of your buddies. Overall, I think the follower quests not only give a fresh new feature to the series, but it is also a life quality change to the franchise. I actually hope to see more of it in the future titles since it benefits not just the story but also the gameplay loop. I would like to note as well that it was really cool that followers were part of urgent quests or main story quests whether you were in single player or multiplayer. I was very surprised to see a Fear Reign with us hunters in multiplayer, which was basically 5 hunters in one map fighting a monster. That hasn't been done before in any Monster Hunter game, and it also helps the immersion for the story since Fear Reign is heavily involved in Sunbreak. Again, this is a big life quality change for the series and I hope to see it again in the next installments. With how Sunbreak's gameplay is very detailed, whether you are talking about its game design or animations, they also managed the time to give more depth to certain systems you wouldn't expect. Although I wouldn't say it's jam-packed, the new implemented systems for your buddies and for eating meals is also a very nice addition to the expansion. Let's start out with talking about the new buddy system of how you're able to fully customize your Palico no matter what support type they are. This helps to give an ideal moveset or skills for your Palicos and put them in many more scenarios where they can react in hunts much better. Don't get me wrong though, the support types for certain Palicos are still very much important since if you were in a scenario where you wanted to be fully on the offense, having a fighter type is ideal. But it is the fact that Palicos are much more flexible now no matter what support type they are. Now I'm able to give my healer Palico much more skills that could help be much more supportive in hunts where I can make a healer Palico into a hybrid of healer and fighter, or fully make it support where I give it skills that could benefit us throughout the hunt. The devs even added one more thing to make the buddies much more reliable, which is the secret support moves that the Palico can use, and these tools can help a bunch. Although you can only pick one for them, that tool can be much more significant in these hunts. Now, although Palicos are much more superior compared to Palamutes, the devs still managed to make the Palamutes incredibly useful with the, obviously, not just the transportation, but they also have new skills and tools to use. But the favorite feature I'll talk about is the sniff 'em out command during hunts. When issued to do so, your Palamute is able to sniff out and help you find specific items within the map. Let's just say you need to find certain ore. Just use your command bar, tell your Palamute to sniff them out. A menu pops out on what you need to find. Simply navigate through the menu on what you want to find and press on it, and automatically your Palamute is able to mark on a map on where these certain items are. Note that you could find multiple things at once, it's not just one item. This is very useful feature to have, especially on quests that are very demanding and specific on items the quest requires you to have. Instead of wasting so much time on traveling around the map, you could just simply ask your Palamute to help you navigate on where these items are. With how the Dango system works, I was also surprised how there are many added skills or new Dangos to use. This new system is the option or mode called Hopping Skewers mode, where it adds additional skills within the Dango. As much as it sounds amazing, there is a risk to them, where you need to put certain Dango in order depending what Dango skill you want to utilize the most, since there is an activation percentage on each one. Typically in base Rise, if you wanted the Dango activation skill on 100%, just use a Dango ticket. But even with a Dango ticket with this whole new system, it is sometimes just not as good to use, since the activation skill percentage is much lower compared to the old system for Dangos. So although there's much RNG to them, there is some luck, some strategy, and risk when using this system. Having this present also gives more of a dynamic hunt, since base Rise or World would typically seem much more calculated on these hunts, since you know what skills to have and how easily you can obtain them. What is also great about this whole new system for those who don't quite enjoy it, the Hopping Skewers mode is purely an option. So you could still settle for the same system of how base Rise did it, but the thing is, you wouldn't be able to have the other skill sets that come with the Dango when on Hopping Skewers mode. You would only have the level 1 skill for it when using the old system. With how post game is in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak is very interesting on how it is approached. There's actually a post game that is very different compared to the base game Rise and World. There's a new variation of how they are handling these tempered monsters, which are called afflicted monsters. Once you beat the main story quest of the game, you unlock these new quests called Anomaly quests, where the monsters are different. So remember how things were with Malzeno, where whenever Malzeno powers up, there's a bunch of those Qurious bug things flying around, which help boost its power and its damage? Well, within the story, the Qurious start to be on the loose after slaying Malzeno and the final boss, which leads up to infecting other monsters. So these afflicted monsters are now infected by them. And within these hunts, the monsters are much more juiced up, hit harder, and have new mechanics to them. In order to do much more sufficient damage and really to stagger them, there are certain red looking blights or particle effects around their body parts, indicating you must hit them to do the most damage. Also, there is a comeback mechanic to these monsters where they just suddenly use an explosion caused by the Qurious, which can get you off guard in the middle of the fight. I really do enjoy how the post game is handled, considering how there wasn't much in base game Rise. It's the fact that there's much more replayability to these monsters, since you could be curious on how crazy they can be with the new mechanics they have. They don't have all monsters or elder dragons from what I'm aware of after my completion of MR100, but I think the powered monsters they promised on their roadmap, when they said there will be powered up monsters as part of these title updates, will be added eventually, which I am absolutely looking forward to. The only criticisms I have for post-game, or just the game overall actually, is that it tends to be bloated with unnecessary leveling, since after post-game, you're required to reach MR100 to meet all monsters through base game of Sunbreak. And I just felt that reaching MR70 was just too much at that point. It was nice that there are post-game monsters to go through, such as Furious Rajang, MR Valstrex, which has a whole new moveset, and Scorn Magnamalo, which is the variant, but it just starts to feel a bit tiring as I progress to MR100. I know at post-game at that point you should have the opportunity to grind out as much gear or builds for weapons that you passively just go through the game to MR100, but it's just much better overall prepping up builds once all the monsters are found and completed, so I know how to start out with these builds instead of using up so many resources to only find out by the end of the game the best gear is there. Regardless, I think the post game is very fun, especially with how the game is with their combat, their skills, and the gameplay loop overall. I feel much more inclined to make other builds that aren't weapons I'm familiar with, since each weapon of the game can feel drastically different, especially with the switch skills mechanic. So the post-game Sunbreak is definitely one of the most fun experiences I had with Monster Hunter. At the time of this recording, the official Monster Hunter Twitter account announced a new feature that will be on the upcoming update for this August, which is called the Qurious crafting, which allows augmentations, something very similar from World, and add these certain abilities. To be honest, I didn't quite expect them to add more features for builds, and this alone really expands to what I said earlier of the variations of how far and wide you could go with these builds. To conclude this, I initially loved Rise for what it was when it released and always loved the fast-paced combat. Now I just really appreciate the game even more of how well polished and how things are just much more designed with thought. The focus is there with the full game of Rise along with its DLC. I personally believe that if someone is new to the franchise, I can confidently say that Rise is the perfect game to start out with. With people who are already familiar with the series of the games, I really do think this game is very unique out of the bunch and will get more exciting once all the content will be released through these updates. I am quite aware that there's still much to talk about Sunbreak with new maps and certain other details, but the video would have been way longer when discussing them. If you do want a brief summary of how I really feel, long story short, I think this is also a very detailed game for what it is and how well organized and compact the game can feel. The maps are also such a refresher to the game, and Jungle is definitely one of my favorite maps to explore and do my quest in. Overall, I didn't expect Sunbreak to be such a game changer to Rise. I did expect to have fun with like the new monsters and the DLC of what they had in store for us, but it made massive changes from what Rise was, and I'm just so impressed with how everything is handled with care. Great job with the team and Capcom. A big round of applause for them.